Moment last week, someone handed me a card with a question on it, and I forgot to bring it upstairs. So, but I think the question was from the Gospel of Matthew, and I think it was that little section about when you're praying, don't babble on like the pagans, but pray simply. So I think it was about why Catholics have so many memorized prayers, and I guess my reply to that is that I think what Jesus is emphasizing when he says, don't battle on like the pagans, it's like we don't have to bombard God with a whole bunch of words. In fact, sometimes just simply being with God and being still and silent with the Lord is a wonderful way to pray. But sometimes we do, as Catholics, we do have repetitive prayers like the Rosary, and the point sometimes about praying the Rosary is not that we're sort of bombarding God with prayers, but by the very repetitious nature of the Rosary, it helps to quiet our mind so that we can focus on the mystery that we're pondering during that decade. So it frees up our brain, sort of like when I'm walking in the park, a repetitive motion of moving in a repetitive way, and kind of free me up to begin to attend to and notice the beauty around me. So that's, by the way, a quick answer. I'm not even sure the person gave me the cards here, but anyway, I'll bring the card next week, so I'll try the right question. All right, so the last time we gathered, the question, the topic was, who is God, the mystery of God? And we really took some moments to think about what this whole question of life is all about. And, you know, either we believe that there is no ultimate meaning behind it, or we trust that there is a meaning behind it, and there is something greater than what's in front of us. And we went from that kind of general perspective to a very powerful encounter with the mystery of God that Moses had in the Old Testament. So for us Catholics, for all Christians, we come tonight to probably one of the most decisive topics of the whole year. And that is the person of Jesus, because the very name Jesus, who is later called Christ, and the word Christ is an English word that basically translates Christos, a Greek word that means the anointed one. So it comes from the Hebrew, Mashiach or Messiah. So in the Old Testament, people were anointed with oil set aside for a purpose, usually a sacred purpose. So priests were anointed to offer sacrifice in the temple. Prophets were sometimes symbolically spoken of as anointed. Think of Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. The Lord has anointed me, Messiahed me, or Christed me. And particularly we think about the kings of Israel who were anointed with oil. So, but the very name Christian comes from that title, Messiah or Christ, given to Jesus. So he is Christos, he is the anointed one of God, and we take that very name. So that's saying something very decisive. The fact that we would choose to be called Christians, as they first were in Antioch, says something about the centrality for us Christians of the person of Jesus. So we're going to be looking at the person of Jesus this week and also next week. It's a two-part series. I will say this. When I was in undergraduate studies at St. Ambrose, I had an entire semester class on Christology, the study of the person of Jesus. And it was called Jesus, His Person and Mission. And the professor was outstanding. So we began by looking at how the New Testament looked at the figure of Jesus. And we looked at the unfolding of how the understanding of the person of Jesus has evolved over these last 2,000 years. And the pivotal years were the first 500 years of Christianity. So we're gonna do a bird's eye overview of that next week. When I got to graduate studies, I took another Christology class that was even more in-depth. And I must admit, it is one of my favorite areas of study. I have an entire shelf of books, or two, on the person of Jesus. But you know, with all those books that I've read about the person of Jesus, there's no better place to begin that I always go back to than the Gospels themselves. They're the first testaments to faith in the person of Jesus. And I want to say this, the Gospels are not history books about Jesus. Because in the first century, Christians didn't think to write a history of the person of Jesus. That's not what the Gospels are about. But the persons who wrote the Gospels had been so impacted by what had happened in the dying and rising of Jesus that their life was forever changed. And the Gospel is giving witness, a testimony to their faith in the figure of Jesus. So we don't have any writings about Jesus that are not written from the perspective of what I call resurrection glasses. So the early Christian community had experienced Jesus after being crucified, risen from the dead, and their lives were transfigured. And these gospel narratives that we've been given are written about 40 to 60 years after his death and resurrection. So this is sometimes a surprise to people. Why did it take so long to write gospels down? If you stop for a moment, why do you think it took so long for a gospel to be written? All right, I hear something over here. Yeah. Exactly, they were busy spreading the good news of Jesus Christ by word of mouth, typically at the beginning. A few quick dates. Jesus is probably born around 4 to 6 BC. Many Christians are like, what? I thought he was born in 0 or 1 or something, AD. And that's primarily because when they created the Christian calendar in the early centuries, they didn't get it exact when they tried to start AD, the year of the Lord, with the birth of Jesus. They were just a few years off. So we have the curious phenomenon that he was born about 4 to 6 years before Christ. So, okay, we can figure that out. Lived about 33 years or so, tradition says 33 at crucifixion, so somewhere around 30 AD, the crucifixion happens. And most biblical scholars today believe that the earliest of the 4 Gospels written about Jesus took place in around 70 AD. And they believe it was the Gospel of Mark. So Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. It's the simplest, it's the most dramatic, and it's the one that presents what I often speak of as the most unvarnished portrait of Jesus. So if you've never sat down and just read the whole Gospel of Mark from beginning to end, I encourage you to do it. It's not that long, and read it like you never met Jesus, because you haven't met him in person, you've only met him sacramentally and other risen manifestations. But imagine what it would have been like to be there about 2,000 years ago and to meet the person of Jesus. So I'm going to swing back around to that in just a minute. So I'm just going to be really, really brief about this, but 3 of the Gospels look a lot alike. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. And they follow the same general overall order, and sometimes they're word for word the same. And so this presented the mystery of, well, how are they connected to each other? And when scholars in the modern world studied them with great care, what they discovered was that there's not just an oral awareness of these Gospels, but there's actually a written dependency. And almost the easiest explanation these days is that Mark wrote his Gospel in around 70, about 10 years later. Matthew had a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of him. He also had what appears to be another written source that had some teachings of Jesus that scholars conveniently call Q, from the German word quell, or source. We have no copy of that. It's a hypothetical document. But what they discovered was if you take the general outline of Mark and you put Matthew and Luke right beside it, which you can buy a synopsis that does that, They follow Mark in his narrative structure, but they start plugging in teachings of Jesus that Mark doesn't have. And not only do they plug in teachings of Jesus that Mark doesn't have, but they plug in the same teachings. So Matthew and Luke both have very similar teachings that Mark doesn't have. And when they plug them into the gospel, they're almost always in the same order, sometimes word for word, the same with some changes. But they don't put them in the gospel in the same location, so they clump them together in different ways. So Matthew clumps them together in 5 big sermons, and Mark kind of spreads them out, or Matthew or Luke, a little differently. So what they've done is they've taken 2 sources, primarily written sources, and woven them together, Matthew and Luke, in their own unique style and theological portrait of Jesus. I often say if we asked 4 people who are about my age to write about the 1970s and what happened with, let's say, what's a big event in the 70s? A big figure. Let's say the election of Pope John Paul II, as Pope, Well, if 4 people my age wrote about John Paul II and the beginnings of his pontificate, each of our narratives would be distinct, but you would recognize a lot of commonality. So I like to speak of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as 4 gospel portraits of the person of Jesus, written by 4 people who are dedicated followers of Jesus Christ, who want to communicate the person of Jesus in such a way as to arouse a faith response on the part of the hearer or reader. So we're going to be looking at Mark this evening, but Matthew seems to be much more connected to the Jewish community down the street when he writes his gospel. Luke seems to be very aware of the Jewish tradition, but also very open to and aware of the non-Jewish Christians that have become part of the church, what we call Gentile Christianity. So we'll also add real quickly, so that the arrows indicate that both Matthew and Luke had access to a written copy of Mark, and also this collection of teachings of Jesus. But both of them also have unique things that only their Gospels have. So scholars sometimes add a little M on one side and an L on the other to indicate those extra sources that Matthew and Luke had. Now, those of you who know about Bible studies and been around a long time probably know that for many centuries, Christians thought Matthew was written first and that Mark condensed him down. But the evidence doesn't point in that direction these days when you look at the problem carefully. And one of the things that you notice when you go from Mark to Matthew, for example, is that in Mark, the disciples don't get it a lot. They get smarter by the time of Matthew. They more readily profess faith in Jesus. Also, reverence for the family of Jesus increases over time. In Mark, who are these crazy people coming to get Jesus? That's what he says about the mother and brothers and sisters of Jesus. But by Luke, they're beautiful portraits of the Holy Family. So Jesus is presented in a more exalted way. I always say it makes more sense as Christianity grows that the disciples get smarter. Jesus' divinity is highlighted, his majesty and respect for his family increases. It would be odd if it happened the opposite, wouldn't it? As Christianity goes on, that the disciples get denser, Jesus is less exalted, etc. I think that's one of the reasons that when you start looking at it carefully, it's compelling to me. So anyway, so we have Matthew has his own stuff, nobody else has. I'll give you one good example. And you all know it well. In Matthew's Gospel, at the end of the ages, the Son of Man will return and he will divide the sheep and the goats up, and they will be judged on the basis of what they have done for the least of their brothers and sisters. When I was hungry, you gave me to eat. That's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. Luke has his own stuff that nobody else has, and some of our favorite things. The prodigal story of the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, the stories of Christmas about the shepherds visiting the birth of Jesus, the appearance of the angel to Mary to announce the birth of Jesus. So Luke has very special things that the other 2 synoptics don't have. I want to mention John real quickly. I've spent, by the way, the last 40 years studying the Gospel, so I've studied them and taught them inside out by now. And the more you read them and study them, the more you realize John is really different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The portrait of who Jesus is, Jesus speaks very differently in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He speaks in parables, and in John's Gospel you have very long reflective narratives. I am the bread of life. Those who eat this bread will live forever. These long, extended, what I call almost theological reflections on the part of Jesus, reflecting about himself. Very unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You also have lots of focus on Jerusalem, and when you start digging into it and you start studying the evidence in Jerusalem, I think the best theory these days is that there was a disciple of Jesus who was in the Jerusalem area who is responsible for John's Gospel, that tradition that got handed down, because it has things that the other Gospels are not as aware of. And it seems to be a community where there was more reflection over an extended period of time on the figure of who Jesus was, and so there's greater depth to it. Someone said it's like, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's like, okay, you have a nice bottle of wine, but John is like champagne. It's more majestic, you know. So anyway, this is a quick observation about John and his uniqueness. So, because Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and likely the introductory Gospel, the first one written, I want to take some time with it tonight. And I always forget to tell you all to bring Bibles, so we don't have any, do we, tonight for them to use?
Well, we have a few.
We have a few, because I always like you to look at the Gospel itself when we're going through it, so, and I always forget to tell people so. So, I will read some elements to you, and so I would say this. The question of who Jesus is the most fundamental question that any of us who want to be Christian will ever answer. There's nothing more important. So once we realize that, then the figure of Jesus becomes central to our quest to understand what this Christianity stuff is all about. And as I often say, Catholicism and the Orthodox churches are the original Christian churches going back 2,000 years ago. So when you ask that question of what it means to follow Jesus Christ, for us Catholics, for the Orthodox, and for any Christian, that's a key question. And the Gospel of Mark is going to paint for us a portrait of who Jesus is. So there's some Bibles around. If you'd like to read out loud, you might grab one of those, because I'm going to ask people to read some sections. But we're going to go right now. So Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel, I think, is a masterpiece. It's one of my 4 favorite Gospels. So, and not just because I'm named Mark, but it is a masterpiece. And it's a masterpiece in what I call narrative theology. Because in the story of Jesus, the profoundness of who he is revealed. And so Mark's Gospel has what I like to call a hinge. The decisive turning point in the Gospel. So if you go to chapter 8, I'm so glad we added verses in chapters about 1,000 years after this was written, so we can find our way through it. So 8:27, this is decisive. So I'll read it out loud. Those of you who are following have a newer translation. 8:27, then Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. So where is Caesarea Philippi? It's at almost the northern end of Jesus' public ministry. He hardly goes north of there as long as he is ministering. He's far away from the Sea of Galilee where he spends most of the time. So you follow the Jordan River from the Sea of Galilee straight up to its source at the base of Mount Hermon where the snowmelt comes down. And it's beautiful. There are springs there. And there are these giant caves in the rock, immense rock formations. On the way, he asked his disciples this question: who do people say that I am? So it's a question about his identity. What are people saying about me? They reply, some say John the Baptist. Well, what about John the Baptist? He had been put to death, beheaded by Herod. Is this John come back to haunt King Herod? That's what some people are saying about him. Others, Elijah. Why Elijah? Andy, why Elijah?
Well, he's the one that brings life. Elijah.
So, yes, he does bring life. So, in first century Judaism, there was a belief Elijah was one of 3 people in the Old Testament who didn't get buried. Moses, Moses got buried, but they can't find his grave. Enoch walked with God. You know, most of the Old Testament genealogy say so-and-so lived to be 500 years, then he died. Enoch lived to be so-and-so number of years, and then he walked with God. It doesn't say he died, which is interesting. The third person is Elijah. At the end of his life, a flaming chariot came and took him up into the heavens. So the Jewish tradition developed that before the Messiah would return, that the prophet Elijah would reappear. So he would come back from the heavens and inaugurate the new Messianic age. And so every year to this day, our Jewish brothers and sisters, when they celebrate the Seder, they always leave a place at the table for Elijah. They're waiting for him to come back. So some people thought Jesus was Elijah returned. Still others want to be other prophets. So then, verse 29, Jesus says, and you, who do you say that I am? So after polling his closest followers on who they think he is, then he asks them the question, what about you? Who do you say that I am? Listen carefully to who answers and the answer he gives. Gospel of Mark, Peter answered him and said, you are, in the Greek, you are the Christos, the Christ. You're the Messiah, the anointed one. And remember, I just told you a little bit about who got anointed. Kings, prophets, priests. Then Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone about him. What do you think Peter meant? You're the anointed one. You're the Christ. I suspect, yes.
Was he just giving like a general answer because he didn't really want to say? I mean, you're saying Josiah was just a term for an anointed one, so is he kind of away from a cop-out answer? Like,
I think Peter has more in mind than a general answer. I think Peter thinks that Jesus is the new David. He is the anointed king that God is sending to liberate his people from the oppression, probably of the Romans. Why would he think that about Jesus? Because when Jesus began preaching the gospel, what did he say? The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent. Believe the good news. I think Simon Peter thought, you're the king. You're the one sent who's going to set us free. Why do I think that? Well, let's look a little further. Jesus began to teach them, and listen to how he describes himself, that the Son of Man, that's how Jesus refers to himself, had to suffer much, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be put to death, and rise 3 days later. He said these things quite openly. This is right after Peter says, you're the anointed one. Then Jesus says, and I'm going to go and suffer and die. And then Peter said to him, took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned around and eyeing the disciples, reprimanded Peter. Get out of my sight, you Satan, you tempter. You are not judging by God's standards, but by human standards. So, even though Peter, I think, correctly identified Jesus as the anointed one, Christ, I don't think Peter knew what it meant. Because when Jesus begins to try to explain, this is going to be a suffering and dying Messiah, Peter doesn't want any part of that. And so much so that Jesus has to say to him, get behind me. Why does he have to get behind him? Because he's going to follow him to Jerusalem. So get on the road with me, Peter. All right, so this is the pivotal point in the Gospels. The first time Jesus asked the 12, who do you say that I am? And Peter is the spokesperson who will give the answer. In Matthew's Gospel, we think written about 10 years later, Peter has a lot more to say. You are the Son of the living God, he'll say in Matthew's Gospel. And Jesus will say to him, you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld will not prevail against it. And remember, the rock cliff that's right behind them is Jesus is having this conversation. So, but here in Mark's Gospel, he doesn't identify him as Son of the living God. He just says, you're the anointed, you're the Christ. And then Jesus says, and the Son of Man is going to die. And Peter says, no, we're not going to have that. Yes, we are. Get behind me and follow me. All right, so I want to point out, by the way, and this is the fascinating thing about what Jesus is doing. I call this little section of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' lessons in discipleship. What does it mean to follow me? I think Mark's Gospel is answering two questions. One, who is Jesus? And two, what does it mean for us to follow him? So he's preparing them to follow him. All right, so once Jesus explains the Son of Man is going to die, and Peter rebukes Jesus at that idea, then Jesus says a second time. So now we're going to go to chapter 9, for those of you who are following along, verse 30. They left that district and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples in this vein. The second time he tells them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men who will put him to death. 3 days later he will rise. Though they failed to understand his words, they were afraid to question him. And right after he tells them, I'm going to die again, second warning, they have a little conversation. You know what their conversation was? They start arguing about which one of them is the greatest, most important. So they don't get the idea, oh, this is not what following Jesus is really about. And then we come to a third one. A third time, this is chapter 10, verse 32. The disciples were on the road going up to Jerusalem. They're on their way for the final time to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be crucified. In Mark's Gospel, they only go there once, with Jesus walking in the lead. Now, their mood was one of wonderment. So the disciples are all excited. We're going up to Jerusalem. We got the king with us. Well, that of those who followed was fear. The crowd might have understood a bit more clearly than the 12. This may not go so well. Taking the 12 aside once more, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. We're on our way up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit at him, flog him, and finally kill him. But 3 days later, he will rise. Now, do you think that the disciples finally go, oh, we get it now? So what do they start talking about the third time? James and John approach Jesus and they say, hey, when we get up there, can we sit on either side of your royal throne? Can we, in your majesty? And Jesus says, you guys don't get it, do you? Can you drink the cup I'm going to have to drink? Can you be baptized in the baptism that I'm going to be baptized in? And they don't know anything. They say, yeah, sure we can. And he says, yes, you will. But. So he's preparing them. So 3 different significant moments of revelation about what's going to happen to he speaks about himself as the human one, the Son of Man. And each time they don't get it, they don't understand. Now, this little section of the Gospel of Mark, which I love, starts with a little story. So let's flip back to that little story. And that little story is in chapter 8, verses 22 and following. This is right before they go to Caesarea Philippi, right before they go there. Chapter 8, verse 22. When they arrived in Bethsaida, some people brought Jesus, a blind man. And they begged Jesus to touch him. Jesus took the blind man's hand and led him outside the village. Putting spittle on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything?" The man opened his eyes and said, "I can see people, but they look like walking trees." So what's happening? This blind man is brought to Jesus. He doesn't see very well. He doesn't go on his own accord. He's brought to Jesus. Jesus tries to heal his blindness. He doesn't see right away, except I see these people walking, but they look like trees. Then a second time Jesus laid his hands on his eyes and he saw perfectly. His sight was restored and he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him home with the admonition, do not even go into the village. So isn't it curious? We have, right before these three predictions of what's going to happen to Jesus, a guy who can't see very well. And Jesus has a hard time getting him to see very clearly, and then he sends him on his way. Well, what happens after those three warnings? Let's look forward in time to chapter 10, verse 46. Right after the third prediction, when they want to be the ones on his right and left. Then they came to Jericho, which is right down in the valley, right before you go up to the city of Jerusalem. And as he was leaving that place with his disciples and a sizable crowd, there was a blind beggar. Blind man starts, now we're back to a blind man. A blind beggar. Bartimaeus, he has a name. How many people that Jesus heals in the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are given names? Not many. So this is a significant figure. Sitting by the roadside, on hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to call out, "Jesus," notice the name, "Son of David." They thought that a son of David would be the king of Israel. "Son of David, have pity on me." So he's not like the first blind, now he's asking, "Have mercy on me." Many people were scolding him to make him keep quiet, but he shouted all the louder, "Son of David, have pity on me." Then Jesus stopped and said, "Call him over." So to call, when Jesus calls somebody, that means they become an apostle, a disciple, if we're going to follow him. So Jesus called the blind man over, telling him as they did so, "You have nothing to fear from him. Get up, he's calling you." He threw aside his cloak, jumped up, and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The questions of Jesus are important. Who do they say I am? Who do you say that I am? What do you want me to do for you? "I want to see," Jesus said in reply. "Be on your way, your faith has healed you." Immediately, he received his sight and started to follow Jesus on the road. The word "follow" is a word for a disciple. So the first blind man gets brought by people. He doesn't see very quickly, and he goes home when he's healed. After three predictions of the Passion, we now have a named blind man who doesn't get brought to Jesus, but he calls out, "I want to see." And immediately has sight, and he follows Jesus to Jerusalem. Well, the question might be, who is this? Who is really blind in the gospel and who needs to be able to see? As the followers of Jesus, we need to see him. We need to see who he really is. So I think Mark has carefully constructed the gospel. These three Passion predictions, misunderstandings on the part of the disciples all three times, and blindness that needs to be healed before and after. It's like a little section of the gospel. And right after that, where do they go? They go right into Jerusalem, where he's going to be crucified and die. So Peter is the one who names him Christ or Messiah. Now, if you are Mark, the gospel writer, did Peter give the best answer, the most complete answer? If you were a teacher and you were going to score him on his correct answer, would he get full credit for that answer? Probably not, actually. Not for Mark. And how do we know that? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the gospel, chapter 1. It's always good to start at the beginning, isn't it? Chapter 1, verse 1, what does Mark tell us? Here begins the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. He uses Christos, the Son of God. He is the Son of God. He's not just an anointed one, he's the very Son of God, is what Mark is telling us right at the beginning. Now, some ancient manuscripts, I will add, omit that phrase, the Son of God. So if you didn't have that little phrase in verse 1, where would we first know that Jesus is the Son of God in the Gospel of Mark? How would you know that if you didn't have it in the title? All right, you're right, Aaron, the baptism. So look at chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. During that time, Jesus, this is the first time in Mark's Gospel we meet Jesus. There's no stories about birth or infancy. During that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. Immediately on coming up out of the water, he, that is Jesus, saw the sky rent into and the Spirit descending on him as a dove. When a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. I am well pleased with you." I would contend that for Mark, that is the most important thing we'll ever need to know about Jesus. And it's told to us where Jesus hears it at the baptism from the voice of God, the Father. So this would be called in the Old Testament a theophany. God is revealing himself. And in Mark's Gospel, it's Jesus who hears it. Now, in the later Gospels, the crowd will hear it. They heard him say, "This is my Son." But in Mark's Gospel, "You're my Son." But we hearers of the Gospel, we know it. So this is a profound moment. Now, I want to ask a question. Do any of the 12, the original followers of Jesus, do any of them say in Mark's Gospel, "You are the Son of God"? No, you're shaking your head. They don't. Not once during Mark's Gospel do they identify Jesus correctly as Son of God, even though we know it from the Father telling us. When will they first hear it, that Jesus is the Son of God? By the way, there are some people in Mark's Gospel who know he's the Son of God. Who are they? All right, we won't get there quite yet, but there's people before that time. Those who are possessed by demons. The demons know who he is. They know his identity. They say, "What have you come to do? To destroy us? We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." Because in fact, the kingdom of God is dawning, and that means that God is conquering the kingdom of darkness. The world of evil, the kingdom of the enemy, knows what's happening. They know the deepest identity of Jesus. But non-possessed human beings don't see it yet. Or when does this get revealed to the disciples? Well, let's go back to chapter 8, that hinge that we just looked at. Right after they go to Caesarea Philippi and he asks the question, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter says, "You're the Christ." And Jesus says, "Well, I'm going to go die now." And they reject the idea. And then Jesus says, "You're all going to have to take your cross and die." Then he says, Mark says in verse 2 of chapter 9, so it's right after Caesarea Philippi, 6 days later, after they've just learned that he is the Christ, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John off by themselves with him and led them up a high mountain. He was transfigured before their eyes. His clothing became dazzlingly white, whiter than the work of any bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, so the greatest Old Testament figures, father of prophets and Moses. The two were in conversation with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus, "Rabbi, how good it is for us to be here. Let us erect 3 booths on this side, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say, for they were all overcome with awe. A cloud came. When you're on a mountaintop and a cloud comes over you and overshadows you, what does this mean? Something big is about to happen, right? In the Old Testament on Mount Sinai, that means God is about to say something very important. Here are the 10 Commandments. You know, picture of the Old Testament, lightning and thunder. You're on a mountain and a big cloud comes up. This is a moment of divine revelation. A cloud came overshadowing them, and out of the cloud a voice. What did the voice say this time? "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, only Jesus. So this is a privileged moment on the Mount of Transfiguration, where the Father reveals clearly to Peter, James, and John, "This is my beloved Son." This is his identity. Listen to him. As they were coming down the mountain, he strictly enjoined them not to tell anyone what they had seen before the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept this word of his to themselves, though they continued to discuss what to rise from the dead meant. So it's not clear, even though they got this revelation. So we know it as hearers because the Father said it at baptism. We know it as hearers because the Father told Peter, James, and John on Mount Tabor. So when does a human being in the gospel finally recognize that Jesus is the Son of God? That's not possessed. And you have the answer to it. Let's look at chapter 14, actually 15. And we'll start in verse 33. It's almost the end of the gospel. When noon came, darkness fell on the whole countryside and lasted until mid-afternoon. At that time, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's the only thing he says on the cross in Mark's gospel. A few of the bystanders who heard it remarked, "Listen, he's calling on Elijah." Someone ran off and, soaking a sponge of sour wine, stuck it on a reed to try to make him drink. The man said, "Now let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down." You see how often Elijah appears in the Gospels? He was in the air. Is Elijah going to come and help him out? Then Jesus, uttering a loud cry, breathed his last. So he'd been telling him, "I'm going to die." And now he just died on the cross. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. What's the sanctuary? It's the Holy of Holies in the temple. It was for the people of Judaism, of God's people, the holiest place in the world, where God dwelt in a very particular and powerful way. So at the death of Jesus, the curtain that separated that place from the rest of the world is suddenly torn apart, torn open. The centurion, Roman soldier, not a follower of Jesus yet, who stood guard over him on seeing the matter of his death, declared, clearly, this man was the Son of God. It's not one of the 12 who identifies the deepest identity of Jesus in Mark's gospel, but it's the Roman soldier who just put him to death and was standing guard over him. So that's a powerful statement, isn't it? Why do you think in Mark's gospel that Mark has constructed the narrative in this way? Why did he wait until the moment of the death of Jesus on the cross for a human being to recognize in faith, this is the Son of God? It might be because we can never understand what it means for Jesus to be Christ, the Anointed One, or Son of God, apart from the cross. It's only when we see the way he gives himself fully for us on the cross that we understand who God really is and what it means for Jesus to be Son of God. So for Mark, this is the profound moment of revelation. And for Mark, it means that the cross is the central mystery of what Jesus did for us. And everything up to that point that we prepared the way is just a preface to get us ready for Calvary. That's really what Mark has kind of constructed in his gospel. It's also paradoxical, but let's look at the end of his gospel, or the original ending, I should say. So after he dies on the cross, he's buried. Chapter 16, verse 1, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought perfumed oils with which they intended to go and anoint Jesus. Why were they going to the tomb on Easter Sunday? They were going to anoint the body of Jesus for burial. So in the Holy Land, when you go into the outer part of the tomb, that's where visitors go. In the inner part, there was a stone slab on which they had laid the body of Jesus and wrapped it in a linen cloth. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the stone had been rolled back. It was a huge one. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man, it doesn't say angel in Mark's Gospel, it says a young man, sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. Who wore white robes in Mark's Christian community?
Pharisees?
No, the newly baptized had been clothed in Christ would put on a white robe. This frightened them thoroughly, but he reassured them, "You need not be amazed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified." So this young man in white robe says, "He has been raised up. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." Now listen to verse 7. "Go now and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." When did he tell them he would see them in Galilee? Do you know when he told them that?
Walking up the road, wasn't it?
It's actually a few chapters earlier. Chapter 14 is at the Last Supper, the evening before he is crucified. He is seated at table and says, "This is my body, this is my blood." And then he says to them, "Your faith in me shall be shaken. I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be dispersed. But after I am raised up, I will go to Galilee ahead of you." Peter said to him, "Even though all are shaken in faith, it will not be that way with me." And Jesus answered, "I give you my assurance this very night before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. So Jesus is saying at that Last Supper, he's saying, when I'm raised from the dead, I'm going to see you in Galilee. And that's exactly what the young man at the tomb in Mark's Gospel says. Tell Peter and the others that he's going to meet you in Galilee. That's interesting, isn't it? Do we have any stories of the risen Jesus appearing in Galilee? Anybody know one? On the Sea of Galilee, John 21. And what are they doing? They're fishing. So what might have happened is, when he got crucified, they might have run off to Galilee to get away. Then they thought they had to go back to fishing. And suddenly now they see the risen Lord standing on the seashore. And John says, "It's the Lord." The beloved disciple says, "It's the Lord." And Peter jumps out of the boat, runs to Jesus. He's cooked breakfast for them. And he feeds them. It's a Eucharistic theme. He'll be present, risen in the Eucharist. And he says, "Simon, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my sheep." He says a second time, "Do you love me?" Third time, "Do you love me?" "Yes, yes, yes." "Then tend my sheep." Why does he ask him 3 times? "Do you love me?"
Because he denied him.
He denied him 3 times. So it's interesting. In Mark's Gospel, he says, "I'm going to see you in Galilee after I rise from the dead." That's what the young man in the tomb says to the women. Go tell him he's going to meet you there. So we have a story about Jesus meeting the disciples on a boat on the Sea of Galilee. It's interesting also in Luke's Gospel at the beginning, when he calls the fishermen to follow him for the first time, where does he find them? On the Sea of Galilee fishing. "Drop your nets and come and follow me." They're probably about the same place. When you go to Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, the location of where he called them to start off with, and the place where he reappears in the resurrection are roughly the same place in the Sea of Galilee. So He meets them where he first met them. This is a new beginning. The women, they made their way out of the tomb and fled. Bewildered and trembling because of their great fear, they said nothing to anyone. ... The oldest manuscripts of Mark's gospel end just that way. So the women are told, go and tell them. And they're terrified. They run away from the tomb, and they say nothing to anyone because they're much afraid. The gospel literally ends with they're much afraid. Why would he end the gospel that way? Anybody know the historical background to the Gospel of Mark? Probably written a little after the mid-60s. Most scholars think in the city of Rome. What happened in Rome in the mid-60s? There was a fire, and the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians, and Peter and Paul were both put to death, martyred. So this may have been the reason that Mark decided to write the Gospel. The first Christians have been put to death, were martyred, and now we have to start committing the narrative to writing. Now, why would he end up with the women were afraid and didn't say anything? Because maybe the early Christian community is afraid now. Now that Peter and Paul have been martyred and the first Christians have been put to death, they're afraid. So, will they have courage? Will they speak the gospel? Will they carry the good news as they know the women did 40 years earlier, or they wouldn't be believers now? So even though Mark doesn't tell us in the gospel that the women did it, they do it. And the readers and hearers knew that the women had carried the gospel to Peter and the others. And the risen Lord had met them. We have stories and accounts of other resurrection narratives. So this is what I say, all four gospels are written with what I call resurrection glasses. They all know the end of the story before they start writing it, and so they can see what's really going on with the deeper eyes of faith. And the narrative is inviting us, the hearers, to say yes to following Jesus as the Son of God, and to be healed of our own blindness. So you notice, we go back to the centurion who's standing by the cross. The centurion who stood guard over him, pay attention to the wording, on seeing the manner of his death, declared, clearly this man was the Son of God. He sees. He's the first human being that's not possessed, whose blindness is healed. Ah, this is the Son of God. So I think the whole Gospel of Mark is written to lead us, potential disciples, to the same conviction of faith that the Roman centurion arrived at. That clearly this man, at the moment we see it clearly in his dying for us, is the Son of God. And the promise that he rises from the dead unless we have the courage now to go and share that good news. So that's why I like to call Mark a masterpiece of narrative theology, because the very narrative way that he structures the gospel communicates the great mystery of faith, of who Jesus is. So who do we say that Jesus is? That's the decisive question for us. And what does it mean for him to be Son of God?
So you're saying that, with all the times, he structured it at the end so that, with God about God, to make the reader have, that realization. Is that what you're meaning by that?
Precisely. It's a gospel narrative, a story probably read. One theory is each year during perhaps an annual Christian reminder of the Passion of Jesus. So it's a perfect gospel for that. It can be read in one sitting easily. The idea, by the way, Paul says it, that the Messiah would be a crucified Messiah was unthinkable to Jews. That God would allow himself to be crucified, and folly, foolishness to Gentiles. Nobody's going to believe this story. Remember, Deuteronomy says, cursed is one who hangs on a tree. This can't be right. So the crucifixion of Jesus was a scandal at the beginning. How can we say this? What erased the scandal? What led the early Christian community to faith? There's no other explanation other than they met the risen Christ and he changed their life. Once they met him, they knew it. He was the Son of God, truly. Nobody else could rise from the dead, destroy death, and inaugurate the kingdom of God in a new way. So Peter was correct in his answer. He is the anointed one of God. He just didn't understand what the kingdom was going to look like and how it was going to be inaugurated and the deepest significance. So yes, the kingdom of God is dawning, but it's going to dawn in the dying of the Son of Man, who will rise from the dead and is also Son of God. So both Son of Man and Son of God. So the thing I want you to think about for a moment is any single person that met Jesus in the first century would have known he was human, right? They saw him eating and walking and teaching and washing feet, doing all the things that human beings do. They had to kind of figure out, we know he's human, but there's something more here, and what is that something more? So that's what they're trying to answer. Are you John the Baptist come back? Are you Elijah? Are you one of the prophets? Are you the anointed one? And what does that mean? Are you going to be a new king? Are you going to kick the Romans out and reestablish the Davidic kingdom in the city of Jerusalem? So anybody that met Jesus in the beginning, many people thought, by the way, he was a fake. That's why they crucified him. He claims to be the Son of God, but that's blasphemy. So we're going to put him to death. That was one reaction to the person of Jesus. So we all might ask the question, how will we react to these unique claims of the person of Jesus? Okay, that's good for tonight. Any questions before we go to small group discussions?
So if Jesus knows that he's going to put to death or is tortured and the final result of what he's telling us prophets, with the last words that he said was, God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, my God, why have you abandoned me or forsaken me? Yeah.
Is that like a altering of his own faith, or is it a statement, or is it our trying to kind of figure it out?
Yeah, that is one of the most profound moments in my mind in the whole Gospel of Mark, because you have two scenes in Mark's Gospel that are very dramatic. One is the agony in the garden, the night he is arrested, and it's after he's told the disciples, one of you is going to betray me. And he goes to the garden to pray and says, keep watch with me. They can't stay and watch, they'll fall asleep, and he's left alone. And that's when he says, Father, if it's possible, take this cup away from me. Which would seem to imply that on the level of his human consciousness, he's saying to the Father, if there's another way, let it be. But in the end, he says, which he perfectly accords his human will to the will of his Father, but not what I will, what you will to be done. So I always say, if Jesus on the cross could ask the question, my God, why have you forsaken me and abandoned me? Then he knows what it's like when we go through those moments when we feel like we're utterly abandoned or forsaken. So when he entered into our humanity, he entered into all of it. He knows what it felt like on the inside of his human consciousness to feel utter abandonment. Now we as Christians know he was not abandoned by the Father, but that's not to say that he didn't enter into that mystery of suffering. And the psalm itself, and Jesus is quoting the psalm, when you read the whole psalm and get to the end, there is a profound trust that God will vindicate the person who feels abandoned or forsaken. So if you read the psalm, you follow all the way through the end. It was common for a Jewish person to start a psalm because you knew how it ended. Our Father who art in heaven, we know it ends with deliver us from evil. So, but I find it reassuring and comforting to know that Jesus so entered into our humanity that he even knows what it's like when we feel abandonment or forsakenness. So one of the things that I've learned from that is, so I'm never alone, even when I feel forsaken or abandoned, because the Son of God is with me at that moment. He asked the same question. Any other questions?
How old was Mark
How old was Mark?
Right.
So we do not know who the gospel writer was. So tradition gave us Mark. That's a 2nd century appellation. So the figure of Mark there was a Mark mentioned in the New Testament that's been connected with it, but we really don't know very much the historical dimensions of the figure of the writer. He has disappeared behind his gospel in history. I can tell you more next week about 2nd century designations of the 4 texts. None of the 4 gospels give us their authorship. In Luke's gospel, he does say who he's addressing. He's addressing it to Theophilus, a friend of God. And in John's gospel, in this moment in the gospel of the crucifixion where he says, the one who is witnessing these things is telling you these things. So you have this hidden self-reference in the gospel of John, of the author.
Can we go over in the future kind of how all of these come together just one by itself as far as the 7 people?
Yeah, so the question of how these got put together, we will do a survey, an overview of the New Testament and of the Old Testament and how Catholics look at Scripture, so that's coming up. And next week I'll do a little bit more because we're going to take how the figure of Jesus was understood beyond the Gospels next week in those first 400, 500 years. I personally find the Gospels, all 4 of them, very inspiring. In terms of reawakening in me the knowing of Jesus, the following of Jesus, and the loving of Jesus. From Day by Day, that musical, day by day, 3 things I pray, to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, to follow you more nearly. When you spend time with the Gospels, that's what happens.
Do we know who the man was in the tomb and how he got there and what the tomb afterwards?
Oh, the man in the white robe. So the only little quick note I'll give you is when Jesus is arrested, there's a young man in a white robe who runs away. And he loses his white robe. He becomes naked. So is this a symbolic portrait of Mark saying that at the moment of the arrest of Jesus, the one who should have been a faithful disciple like the 12 ran away and left his baptismal garment behind? But in the resurrection, our baptismal grace is restored. Clearly when you read Matthew and Luke, it's 1 or 2 angels. So, and it could be that even in Mark, he intends us to understand, in fact, that the young man in a white robe is an angelic presence. Because remember, angels in the Old Testament often appear in human forms. They were messengers from God. I do think it's curious, though, that young man in white robe, he's arrested, runs away, loses his white garment. But at the tomb on Easter Sunday, the young man is wearing a white robe. So I think there's a connection between the two myself, but who knows? I think Mark is very artistic in his writing.
So it was interesting to me that the first blind man that he healed took 2 tries.
Took 2 tries to heal.
The other one, he basically said, just go on your way. And
Boom.
Is it in essence that is,
Your faith has healed you.
or is he going stronger and lighter?
No, I think remark it's simply that earlier in the gospel, the disciples have a hard time saying who Jesus really is. And by the end, Bartimaeus is the symbol of the disciple whose eyes are opened. So we're more readily opening our eyes to see the true identity of Jesus and willing to follow him to Jerusalem, to the cross, and therefore the resurrection.
It seems like symbolism of blind men being disciples.
I think the blind men are symbolic of discipleship. Disciples, we need to have our eyes open to see who Jesus really is. We need to follow him to the cross and to the tomb. Which is not to say that there weren't blind men Jesus healed, but Mark is also able to understand those healings with multidimensional meanings to them. Yes, he did heal physically blind people, but he's also healing more than that. He's giving us the deeper side of faith along the road. All right, we've got great questions, I think, at your table, so I'll ask you guys a few minutes to kind of ponder those questions. So, great, so do you,